break, I said, I want you back in here, and I'd go through that whole spiel, because if you didn't, they'd just hang around somewhere in the hallway somewhere. Okay, I'll introduce myself. I'm Bob Dawson. I've done several programs here. I am an amateur historian. That's with a capital A, so I want you to remember that. Also, I make no apologies because, as John Wayne said in the movie, don't apologize, it's a sign of weakness. So anyway, but your mother wouldn't agree with that. So anyway, and I retired from Louisville Gas and Electric, where I was a safety specialist and had to do classes and all this kind of stuff. And then later on, I volunteered with the American Red Cross for about 15 years as an instructor. So that's why I said when I sent them on break, you had to make sure they came back in. So anyway, I've always been interested in history. I was always interested in World War II. And just to set the record straight, I was 4 years old when World War II ended. So take that as it may. I do remember when I got my adult library card at the Shawnee Library, I could now go into the history room. And they had all these books on World War II, which a lot of them were current books in a way. And so I began reading all of those. This is about my uncle, Joseph Patrick Ballard. I will admit I only really got to sit down and interview him one time. A lot of the other things I picked up in here are either things that were said in the family, sort of like hearsay, or I was with the internet, you can look up all sorts of things, and I looked up the history of the ships that he was on. So that a lot of it came from that. And it wasn't that he didn't really not want to talk about it. It just, I don't think anyone knew what to ask about it. It's basically, what did you do in the war? Okay. So I think that was partially it. And right before he passed away, and I'll mention when we get further in the program, I had looked up some things on the internet, and I had questions to ask. And he was glad to provide the answers. In case anybody doesn't know, VJ Day, VJ is victory over Japan. And so I called this from Pearl Harbor to what we most think of as the beginning of the U.S. involvement in World War II, specifically in the Pacific, but actually his career started before that. Now, okay. Let's start off at the beginning. He was born March 17, 1921. That's St. Patrick's Day. That's why his first name was Patrick. He was named for his father, middle name Joseph Albertus Ballard, and Teresa Petronella Flick. Now, he's from an old family in Kentucky. She was from a new family in Jasper, Indiana. And, well, how did that happen? Like, lots of things happened. He was attending college in Jasper when they met. So anyway, they came back to Kentucky. Okay, this is his sisters. That's him, the little guy there, that's him. And holding his shoulders is his aunt, either Irene or Leona. They're identical twins. Even when they were 90 years old, they were still dressed alike and everything else. So they were identical twins. I have no idea which one it is. Each child there is carrying a bag of candy. How do I know that? Because when they would come visit, I would get a bag of candy. So they always, this was in 23, 24, probably when this picture was taken, from left to right. That's my mother, Matilda, there holding her bag of candy. She always had that smiling look on her face. And then his sister, Catherine, and then his older sister, Mary Favila. That she always went by Mary when she could, but in the family she was always Fab. And one thing I always learned was, for some strange reason, everybody was always referred to by their middle names. It's just the way they did it. I have no idea why. But anyway, this was taken in front of the grocery store that his dad, Joseph Albertus, only he always went by Albertus, and he had the grocery store up there near Chestnut Street, up near Ursula Academy, as a matter of fact. Okay, after he turned 21, in 1938, he enlisted in the U.S. Navy. Now, what was going on then was the Depression was still on. Jobs were scarce. And also, I think he saw a sense of adventure about being able to go in the Navy. And I always wondered, and there's no clear answer, why did so many people from the internal United States join the Navy? And I worked with an awful lot of guys who joined the Navy in the 30s and 40s, and they all came from the middle, Kentucky, someplace like that, nowhere near the blue water. I think it was just the adventure. Now, one claim was he saw Fred Astaire movies and thought that was neat being on a battleship like that, but I really don't believe that. I think it's a little bit more practical than that. He went to boot camp at Great Lakes Naval Station outside Chicago. I'm pretty sure this is where this picture was taken. It was at Great Lakes. I'm assuming that he went to some sort of a specialist school after he left boot camp. The way we used to do it most of the time in the Army, and even in 1938, I'm pretty sure the Navy did something like that a lot of times. You had a lot of trades, if you want to call it that, in the Navy that you could go into. And he later served all his time as a torpedo man. So I have a feeling he went to torpedo school. This may have been the first ship that he was on. It definitely wasn't a cruise ship. This was an ammunition ship, which had the neat name of the USS Nitro. And it was built right at the beginning of the 20th century. And in 1939, it was delivering ammunition to all the different bases to the Caribbean and Gulf area of the United States. You notice all the cranes and everything on it for offloading the ammunition. I've never figured out what the birdhouse is on the front end there is, but anyway, that was the kind of ship it was. And that took him to Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. The Guantanamo
Hey Bob.
Station. Yes.
So I noticed the ship appears to be painted white, and I know the battleships like in 1898 were also painted white. What was the logic behind that?
Well, I would say, first of all, it's hard to tell whether it's white or just gray, light gray.
Okay.
But remember, the idea then was to see a ship, not to hide a ship. So, I mean, when they got into the war, the idea was, let's hide the ships. But back then, it wasn't so much. They wanted to be visible. And that, but I would say that's probably a light gray, I'm guessing.
It is.
But that'd be the normal thing. Once he got to Guantanamo Bay, he joined the crew of the USS Mahan. Now, I've heard most of the time it's named for Albert Thayer Mahan, and most of the time it's pronounced that way. Every time I ever heard the ship, it was pronounced Mahan, so that's what I'm going to do, or otherwise I'll stumble all over the words anyway. But anyway, he joined on 15 March 1939 as the crew of the USS Mahan, and the ship was only a few years old, I think 1934 or something like that when it was commissioned. It was a destroyer. A lot of times they were called tin cans. And why was it a tin can? Because they might have well been made out of tin. It had almost no protection against anything on it. But anyway, this was his first ship, and the Mahan had been in operations it had been based in Hawaii, and it came to the Caribbean for fleet problems, in other words, exercises and maneuvers in 1939, and that's how come he was able to marry up with the ship there. So it would make a lot of sense to get from Norfolk to Guantanamo. Let's see. Doesn't want to cooperate. I know, I always make it cooperate. Okay, he wasn't on the ship very long. 4 days later, he mailed this letter to his sister Catherine and her husband Robert Douglas Spaulding. He was always called Red for the obvious reason he had red hair. But anyway, this, you see, it was postmarked from USS Mayhan, and it gives you the date and everything. And love that first class postage, 3 cents. You can't do that anymore. And the letter is not preserved. I call it a letter there. Actually, it's a cover. If you're a stamp collector, you know that a stamped postmarked envelope like that is called a cover. And Mr. Spaulding, Red's dad, was an avid stamp collector, big time stamp collector. And he collected, whenever anything interesting was sent, he'd ask for it and put it in his collection. Like I've got some covers from his collection that were postmarked by Admiral Byrd at the South Pole. Different things like that. These were the ones that they couldn't sell. So I can't imagine what he had that they could actually sell when the man passed away. So anyway, and I have a feeling this letter said, well, guess where I am? You know, it was this brand new ship. Okay, as I said, it was named for Albert Thayer Mahan, who was one of the, he wrote the definitive book on strategic naval warfare, and it was well read by the Japanese. He was one of their favorite authors. And that, but he kind of set the stage of what the strategic use of navies could do in the modern world. Like I said, it was laid down in 1934, commissioned in 36, and in February of 1939, it would cruise to the Caribbean for fleet maneuvers. So that kind of put him there. Then, I'm assuming once they were over and he was on the ship, then they headed back to Hawaii. This is kind of a close-up of Mahan. Actually, this comes from after he was already gone from the ship. But it gives us some good ideas of what the ship looked like. Something I never realized, I've seen a picture of side view, I didn't realize the rear of the gun turrets were open. I didn't, you know, because you didn't see that before. Those are 5-inch multi-purpose guns, both against surface or anti-aircraft use. The circles in there are highlighting all the updates that were done to it, I think, in 1944. And up the top here is the fire director's station, and the top is off of it. And because normally it would look like a turret itself, but it showed all the stuff inside it, and they circled the new radar system that was on it and that. But one thing it gives you also how cramped a destroyer was. I mean, there's not a lot of room to move around on here. And on a destroyer of this era, as far as I know, you could not go from the front of the ship to the back of the ship inside. It did not have through passageways. You'd have to come outside, which in some cases, if you want to get to eat, you might have to come out in the middle of a storm or something like that and make your way through on the outside there of the ship and back to the other side. Like I said, they were in Hawaii, and there was always actions going on in Hawaii, training going on, and preparing for not necessarily this attack. I mean, there was always proposed that the Japanese or somebody could attack Hawaii from the air, going back to the 1920s. But so they weren't specifically saying, okay, the Japanese are going to be here in a few weeks, we're going to do all this training. No, they would always, in the military, you always train for eventualities, many of them. Like for years, there was a plan, maybe still be one, for defense against an invasion from Canada, for all I know. But these are things that they kept. So what was the fleet doing? I kind of threw these in for a couple of reasons. One, they do show things that he would have seen. Also, I just like the pictures, I'll be honest. I really like the pictures. What we're looking at here, you see, these are Douglas Devastator torpedo bombers. As far as I could tell, they were from the USS Enterprise. And of course, Life magazine did a big spread of these, and somehow they put them on the internet for a short while until guys like me took them down, and then they took them down. So anyway, the Devastator is famous or infamous for being wiped out in the Battle of Midway. These airplanes were very slow and real sitting ducks, and Torpedo Squadron 8 made an attack during the Battle of Midway, and every plane was lost in the squadron, except for one guy, I think, who floated around on a raft during the whole battle. So anyway, kind of give you some idea. Again, Bob Franklin was saying something about the white ship. Notice how bright those airplanes are. The idea is if they get lost at sea and the airplane's still floating, you're going to see it. The chrome yellow wings, the tail identified the aircraft carrier that they were assigned to, and had large numbers on them. So those were designed, they were painted for high visibility. This is another picture from the deck of the Enterprise. Sometimes the Mayhem would be on screening missions. Screening means protection against aircraft attack or submarine attack. Because one of the missions of a destroyer is anti-submarine. They were well known. That's one of the main things. One of the many main things they did, especially in the Atlantic, was anti-submarine warfare. So these are, for any aircraft people, these are Northrop dive bombers. Again, I mentioned the Navy. Everybody did little things differently. The Navy identified aircraft by the mission of the aircraft, who made the aircraft, and what number it was of the airplane. Was this the first airplane made, the second airplane, whatever. This is a BT-1. Bomber, B for bomber, T for Northrop. Well, why T? Because N was for Naval Aircraft Factory. It was already taken, so they couldn't do it. And it was the first bomber accepted from Northrop. Again, Northrop was tied in with Douglas at the time, and some of y'all might remember. This plane was redesigned, fired up, and became the Douglas Dauntless dive bomber during World War II. Our main bomber, Navy bomber during the war. Okay, September 1941, he was promoted to seaman, from seaman first class to torpedoman third class. We go from third, second, first being the highest rating. A friend of mine gave me these muster reports, and so some of the information on his service record, I may able to take off the muster reports because they were quarterly, but they would tell you like, okay, so-and-so got promoted, or something like that. It wasn't a log, but it gave you some information. What was going on in 1941? Okay, the map is kind of hard to figure out. The areas in black are either Japan itself or the areas occupied by Japan. Remember, in 1941, Japan had been at war with China for like 4 years. So, and maybe not quite a third of China, including Manchuria, was under Japanese occupation. Along with, if you look along the coast, you see the little enclaves that Japan held. Hong Kong was not one of them. It was a British protectorate, but you can see it was totally surrounded by the Japanese. The grid area shows the other areas that they controlled, the islands and that, and down towards the bottom there above where it says the Carolines and the Caroline Islands is the American island of Guam. So again, they were completely surrounded by the Japanese. So it kind of gives you an idea of where this was in November 1941. That is the Pacific East Asia area. Task Force 12. They would form task force to do a specific mission. Okay, Task Force 12 consisted of the USS Lexington, which the Lexington was one, not the first, but one of the first aircraft carriers in the U.S. Navy. There was a treaty after World War I limiting the size of ships. And the U.S. Navy had already laid down 2 cruisers, and they couldn't complete them, but they could complete them as aircraft carriers. So the cruisers became the aircraft carriers Lexington and the Saratoga. This is a picture earlier in his career, not too earlier. It's delivering fighter planes probably to Hawaii. The planes on the bow of the ship are probably one of the worst fighter planes the U.S. Navy had during World War II, the Brewster Buffalo. And I'm thinking the planes to the back are Dauntless dive bombers. But the first time I saw that picture, I saw those fat little airplanes. I said, those got to be Brewster Buffaloes, and they were terrible airplanes. But anyway, what they were doing, you see the Mayhem was with the other destroyers, the Drayton, Lamson, Flusser, and Porter. Destroyers are named after people. Aircraft carriers in those days were named after battles. So the Battle of Lexington, the Battle of Saratoga. Cruisers, for the most part, were named after cities, large cities. And so the cruisers, Chicago and Portland, were the cruisers and the task force, and of course the destroyers. And always, somehow the Mayhem and the Lamson always ended up together doing things. We'll cover that a little bit more. What their job was, they were delivering Vindicator dive bombers to Midway. Now these are U.S. Navy Vindicators, which were pretty almost obsolete when the war started. But anyway, these are in the bright pre-war colors. The airplanes they were delivering were U.S. Marine Corps Vindicators. Probably that's why the Marine Corps had them, because they were almost obsolete. And they were painted gray, and that to make them more a seagull gray color. And the insignias were smaller, and they didn't have the bright numbers and stuff on them. But anyway, these were the Vindicators. When the word came of Pearl Harbor, the attack going on, the captain of the Lexington told them, "You guys got to go. they're going to have to fly back to Pearl Harbor because they need to clear the decks for the Lexington's fighters and bombers to be able to operate. And these planes were occupying the deck, so they flew back to Pearl Harbor. Of course, for them, good thing because they missed the whole thing. There's a chance these airplanes end up eventually back at Midway again. But anyway, that's what they did on that day. I asked Joel, I said, okay, I said, what did y'all do? And he said, well, he was a young guy on the destroyer, he knew what was going on. He said, we looked all over the place for the Japanese. They had absolutely no clue where they were. After we spent all these days going around, they finally decided they were finally ordered back to, decide. They were ordered back to Pearl Harbor. So when they got to Pearl Harbor, this is what they saw. And this is probably the day of the attack, but it hadn't changed much a few days later, almost a week later when they came back. Everything was burning. Their anchorage, as you came in to Pearl Harbor, their anchorage was to the left. And that's where they went to, and it had not been hit. So they then eventually, they started sending them back out again. They went on several missions looking for the Japanese, doing protection. They even tried a few things to punish the Japanese a little bit. There's not much you could do. Maybe shell a few locations or something like that. Well, on January 1942, they were escorting the USS Sabine, a fleet oiler. As people have told me, I didn't know this at the time. What's the difference between a tanker and an oiler? A tanker transports fuel, oil, gasoline, and that. An oiler transports fuel and transfers it to the ships. So it's a working thing. It's not a transport. It's a working thing. They were going to Pago, and they crossed the equator. Of course, there's a big ceremony when you cross the equator. It gets pretty rowdy sometimes. And I could not find one. Obviously, the Mayhem crossing the equator didn't hit the internet. But I did find this picture a few years earlier of the cruiser USS Augusta when they crossed the equator. Also, I read an account of another destroyer, and they crossed quite later than the Mahan did, and they were in action in the Aleutian Islands. When they crossed the equator, they knew which officers they wanted to get even with. So, and those officers, and there was no rank involved here. The experienced people had already been, the shellbacks who had already been across the equator, they could do all kinds of nasty stuff to the ones that weren't, and those officers paid dearly for what they, turnabout's fair play, I guess. But anyway, that was they did cross the equator. Something I always thought about, and I thought, wow, the Battle of the Coral Sea, he was there, the Battle of Midway. These were some of the big turning points of the war. They were the first major battles of the war. They were the first naval battles where the surface ships never saw each other. The first time in history a naval battle was fought where the ships never saw each other. It was strictly an air battle. Carrier planes against carrier planes. I thought, well, surely he was there. Well, he wasn't. I always had this thought that somehow he was at the Battle of Midway, and some of the things that he had described was at the Battle of Midway, and I figured out, no, it wasn't, because he wasn't there. Where was he? The U.S. Mahan had completed an overhaul in San Pedro, California. It was on calibration runs on California. What they had done was, it was hard to tell from that picture, there was 5 gun turrets on the Mahan. There was 2 in the front. There was one sort of facing forward behind smokestacks. There was some more superstructure there and 2 more turrets. They removed the number 3 turret. To me, it was in a bad place anyway, and they replaced it with anti-aircraft guns because it became before that, the only anti-aircraft weapons they had was a 50 caliber machine gun, other than their 5-inch guns, which were dual purpose. So it really made it, and they instantly saw that they needed more anti-aircraft protection. So anyway, it was at the Battle of Midway, which really is considered one of the big key turning points of World War II. They were escorting convoys back between Hawaii and California. Everybody can't be everywhere at the same time. So eventually, now they were moving, given the south, they were at Pago, and now they were moving south. And it says here, south of the Gilbert Islands, and this is from a website, at 1300 hours or 1 p.m., they were spotted by a Japanese scout plane. 10 minutes later, they engaged and sank a 3-masted schooner. Okay, I looked for pictures of a Japanese schooner on the internet, and this is what I came up with. This is a schooner later in the war, identified as a schooner that was attacked, it was boarded and sunk by a U.S. submarine. And this is a screen grab from a video showing that. And so they said it was a schooner, it's got 3 masts, so this is probably what they saw, was a Japanese sail, type of schooner. So anyway, they sank that. Then they came in contact with a Japanese auxiliary cruiser. Now again, no name was mentioned of what the name of the cruiser was. This is the Ayakoko Maru, which is a Japanese auxiliary cruiser. What is an auxiliary cruiser? It's basically a merchant ship that has been armed to function as a cruiser for scouting missions or support landings and that sort of thing. It wasn't out to attack merchant ships. Its job was to provide scouts and a couple of things. First of all, this picture shows it painted what I call the splinter version, which in World War I they called dazzle paint. In other words, to break up the silhouette of the ship. So from a distance, it'd be hard to pick out what exactly is it and which way is it going. That's valid. I looked at this picture. On the stern, on a platform, it looks like to me there's a gun turret, and on the bow, and on the stern, there's another gun turret. And there's also an airplane. on there, because cruisers didn't launch airplanes for scouting. And then, so it kind of fits the description of what he told me about this action with this cruiser. He said they were with the Lamson, and they found this cruiser, and they took it on. Well, the thing about it was, every time they thought they knocked out the stern gun, they start moving up and suddenly be manned again and start lobbing shells at them again. And so he said this happened a couple of times. He said, so finally they split up. You thought they would have already, but they split widely apart so that they could both attack it to where the gun could only fire on one of them at a time. And so they did that. Finally it hit the ship and it started sinking. Now, I didn't know the date on this when he told me the story, but everything kind of ran together in his mind. And he stopped for a minute and he says, now you realize this was right after Pearl Harbor. Well, it was several months after Pearl Harbor. In his mind, it was right after Pearl Harbor. He says, we pulled up beside that and the captain announced machine gun practice. And he said, when we finished, there was nothing moving on that ship. It was everything. They just totally killed everybody on the ship.
Wow.
And of course, they didn't know at the time, probably no one would have surrendered anyway. But they didn't know that. But anyway, I remember he stopped that and he paused for a minute and he said, you got to remember now. So he knew it wasn't quite right what they did, but that's the way they did it. Yeah.
Bob, I might mention at this point, those are probably 5-inch guns, fore and aft.
Think so?
But an auxiliary cruiser also carried 5 and 6-inch guns in the superstructure, and you can't see them. And they were well armed and dangerous, and for the destroyers to take them on took a lot of guts.
That's what I was thinking. I didn't know where all the guns were, but the fact that
They're hidden in that well, not hidden, but they're mounted in the superstructure.
just as an aside, had nothing to do with this, the Germans used a lot of those for World War II for commerce raiders. And
Yeah.
but yeah, I think, but I figured those were probably 5-inch guns on this,
Probably
on
is.
each end, but I wasn't sure about the other. Okay, that was at 2:10, so less than an hour after they sunk the schooner. Then, shortly thereafter, they were attacked. The Lamson was bombed by a Kawanishi EK-7 Type 94. Now, that's a lot of things to say. So the U.S. Navy gave them code words. And you always hear, that's an ALF, A-L-F. And they would not say a Kawanishi, we were attacked by an ALF. That's what they would say. And so it was a float plane, probably, I don't think from a cruiser, but it was from nearby islands. And it spotted them, they fired at it, and they didn't get any hits. So they continued on south till they got to the Battle of Santa Cruz Islands. This is where I think some of the stories when I was a little kid that I heard that he talked about, that this is where it happened at, was at the Battle of Santa Cruz Islands. Okay, this is not one of those battles that everybody falls off. The Battle of Santa Cruz Islands, no movies have been made about that I know of, or anything else. But there was a lot of battles that took place in there. That's why the area around Guadalcanal was called Iron Bottom Bay, because of all the ships that were sunk there and all the different things. What had happened was the Japanese were making a move, hopefully, to take Australia. If nothing else, they were going to take New Guinea, but they were going to try to take Australia. Their hope was, I think, to take part of Australia and get Australia to give up, to get out of the war. That was, and so they started building an airstrip on Guadalcanal. Well, as soon as the Americans realized they were building this airstrip, Guadalcanal suddenly became a priority. It was kind of like not really before that airstrip came about. There's been movies made about Guadalcanal. The key thing to know is the Americans landed on a shoestring, basically. They captured the airfield, which was almost finished. They had no equipment, so they had to use the Japanese construction equipment to finish the airfield. They had to use the Japanese rice to eat because the Navy left them high and dry. The Navy left. They said, no, there's a fleet coming. We're sorry, you guys are on your own. And the Navy left. So this started a long, prolonged battle over Guadalcanal, which eventually the Marines were reinforced. The Japanese would run reinforcements down to the Solomon Islands trying to reinforce it. And all this was going on. Well, the Japanese Navy, which rarely coordinated with the Japanese Army, they really didn't care for each other very much, they sent a carrier task force towards the Santa Cruz Islands. At the same time, the Army was going to do a push to reinforce Guadalcanal. So the idea was the Navy could siphon off and maybe get rid of what was left of the American carriers. For one, the U.S. had almost no carriers by this time. And so they would get rid of them, and it would be kind of a win-win for the Navy and the Army. Well, what happened was, this is again one of those battles where the surface ships didn't even come in contact with each other. This is the USS South Dakota. What you're seeing there, all that smoke in the center, that's their 5-inch anti-aircraft guns and other anti-aircraft guns flying. The plane coming in there is a Nakajima Kate. Japanese, we code word Japanese bombers with female names. Japanese fighters had male names. And there was a whole thing of names for all kinds of things. But anyway, this is a Kate. The Kate was primarily a torpedo bomber, but it may also have been just going to lob some bombs in there. But anyway, the South Dakota is fighting it off. Joe was there. This is what, this is the Enterprise. I think they were attached to screening the Enterprise. The Enterprise here had been hit by a near miss, and it was actually hit. You see all the little puffs of smoke along the side. That's all the anti-aircraft guns from the Enterprise firing against the Japanese plane. The black puff balls you see up in the sky, that's shrapnel coming from anti-aircraft fire, hoping to catch the airplanes in it. Off to the front of it, you see a destroyer there to the front of the Enterprise. The Enterprise was damaged in its bombing, and we'll kind of discuss that a little bit. This is kind of what it looked like. There's the Enterprise on the horizon there. The sky is totally full of anti-aircraft fire. And something you can't see here is totally full of airplanes trying to kill him. So, I mean, something to think about it. That's what was there. And I just can't imagine being you don't hide on a destroyer. There's no place to go. So this was all going on when it happened. On the 26th, this battle actually happened on the 26th, 27th, and this is the loss of the USS Hornet. There was 2 aircraft carriers operating, and that was about it. That's about what we had in the Pacific, was the Hornet and the Enterprise. The Hornet, you can see it's already been hit once. Coming down on top of it is a Val dive bomber, getting ready to bomb the Hornet. Crossing over is a Kate torpedo bomber. So, and you can see another hit, another smoke where the Hornet's been hit again here, and you can also see the deck of the Hornet. It's beginning to list to the right as, to the right as it begins to fill with water. The Hornet, for all practical purposes, was 1 year old when this happened. It was commissioned in October 1941, and it sank in October 1942.
The 26th, each one.
Yeah, and but the 20th was when it was commissioned, wasn't it? Something like that. Anyway, it was commissioned. But what the Hornet was also the plane that launched Jimmy Doolittle's bombers against Japan. So it already had a spectacular career before it. I mean, it did something nobody thought could be done. Twin-engine Army bombers being launched off an aircraft carrier on almost a suicide mission, but still. So it had a distinguished career in a very short life. Here's the Hornet right before it went down. Now it has a specific list, and let's see. Okay, the U.S. Navy, it would come to the point they couldn't save it. So the point was we're going to sink it. So the U.S. Navy fired torpedoes at it. We had the worst torpedoes in the world. Most of them would not go off. They would hit, if they got to the target at all, they wouldn't explode when they got there. So, so they found, then all of a sudden here comes the Japanese across the horizon. So the U.S. ships have to leave. The Japanese pull up, they look at it. It would have been great if they could have towed it back to Japan. They would have had a new carrier, but they couldn't do it either. Well, they had the best torpedoes in the world. And so they torpedoed it and sank it. That's what happened to the
Fortunately.
Do what?
Fortunately.
Yeah, fortunately. Yeah, yeah, that would have been, if Japan had been able to salvage that ship, it would have been a really, it would have been a thorn in our side would be an understatement. Here is the Mahan closest to the camera, and believe me, either the Smith or the Lamson the other way. And over the top of the Mahan, you can see the superstructure of the South Dakota, the battleship South Dakota. And this is during the battle itself. And there's a picture, that one picture of the Enterprise, I think, showed what looked like two destroyers off in the distance. I keep wondering if that wasn't them. Take it from a different angle. Anyway, that was the Mahan was credited with down two Japanese bombers. The top is a Val dive bomber. That was, and the second one is a Cape torpedo bomber. These are the two airplanes that did all. These are two types of airplanes that did all the damage at Pearl Harbor: the Val dive bombers and the Cape torpedo bombers. A few days later, the Mahan was maneuvering near the South Dakota. Well, I understood trying to evade submarines, or they have submarine contact anyway. And what happened was the Mahan and the South Dakota collided. Now you have a destroyer colliding with a battleship, and that's a little much. So anyway, that was on 30 October, 3 days after the battle, almost 4 days after the battle, and they collided with the South Dakota. What we're looking at here from top to bottom, first is the South Dakota. Kind of big, isn't she? When you compare her to the other thing. Next to the South Dakota is the repair ship Prometheus. And then next to that is the Mahan. And then the Lamson. And it's kind of a blurry picture, but you get a close-up. Look at the bow of the Mahan. It's not exactly there. And it's what they did was they came back with the help of Prometheus, because they had all the machine shops and all the stuff that you needed to do heavy work. They put in a temporary bow and bulkheads so that the Mahan could get underway and get back to Pearl Harbor. And so that's what they, but I always thought, you compare the two ships. This is what it should have looked like, and that's what it did look like. So anyway, there was no evidence that I know of anybody being hurt. And unfortunately, when I talked to him, I didn't know about this. Otherwise, I would have asked me. Definitely, he would have remembered. Okay. 24 November, they departed Pearl Harbor for repairs. And by February 43, they went back to Bora Bora and then on into the Pacific. And there they operated off Guadalcanal and supported operations. I said the Solomon Islands, New Guinea, which is where MacArthur's army was fighting at, and then New Britain. After he had left the ship, that's when they went back in June 1944 to Mare Island. And that picture I showed at the very beginning with a close-up of the bridge and all that with the guns and the circles and all that, that was taken at Mare Island when they went to that. At some point he became, it said illness on the log sheet. I don't know what that meant. I mean, I ran into the same thing with a Civil War ancestor. He ended up in the hospital. All they say is in the hospital. They say why. So they didn't say why here. But anyway, he was taken to the destroyer tender USS Dixie, and he was there for almost a month on the Dixie. So this is the Dixie taken at Leyte in the Philippines later, and so you guys know those are Sumner class destroyers tied up to the Dixie. And I showed this because destroyers, even a larger one like a Sumner class destroyer, which was bigger than a Mahan class destroyer, they were very limited in things they could do, amenities and other things that they could do. The Dixie had repair facilities, hospital or medical facilities, all this sort of thing. And also it could provide something that was very important to the crew that the destroyers couldn't: ice cream. You can make ice cream on there. The destroyers could not make ice cream. And that was one of the most important commodities in the South Pacific was ice cream.
I thought you were going to say women for a minute.
No, ice cream. They gave up. They didn't want to be any women. I mean, you might see that movie South Pacific. No, it didn't work that way. And or even Mr. Roberts.
That was supposed
Yeah,
to
Mr. Roberts.
was ice cream.
Yeah, ice cream. And so that was the big thing. At about that time, he moved on. He went. He was assigned. He was taken off the Mahan. He went on leave. He went to school, and he went to a new ship. My cousin Charlie's here. He'll probably remember this lady sitting next to him. He came. This is a visit he made to us at some point there. And of course, I was like 2 years old, so I remember nothing whatsoever about it. The lady there is Margaret Huffman, and she was she'd never married. She was a good friend, very good friend of the twins, Irene and Leona. They kind of like grew up together when they come down here to Louisville. And if you had a wedding, if you had anything, Margaret would be there. And she'd also show up when she come visit you with little kids. She'd show up with toys. The kind of person she was. And that. So anyway, then he went to advanced torpedo mate school in Newport, Rhode Island. Once he left the school, he joined the John W. Weeks, actually before the Weeks was commissioned. A few days before it was commissioned, he was actually assigned to the Weeks, which that was the whole plan, I think. He was going to be on the John W. Weeks. You notice the camouflage paint on the Weeks. A lot of the ships by this time were being camouflage painted. The idea is not to hide it. The idea is confuse an attacking airplane. It's exactly what your target is.
Was that a newer class of destroyer?
Yeah, that's a much newer class than the Mahan.
It looks significantly
Oh
larger.
yeah, it's got, see the twin gun mounts with
Right.
twin 5-inch 38s on it, more advanced radar. In fact, this ship served all the way through the Vietnam War. So it was named for a guy I never heard of, John Wingate Weeks, who had been a Secretary of the Navy in the 1920s, and so it was named for him. And like I said, it was launched, it laid down to New Jersey, and he joined it, I believe, in New Jersey before it was commissioned. And then they spent a lot of time cruising back and forth between the States and South America for calibration runs, shakedowns, all this sort of thing, make sure everything was like work. And also so the crew could train together. They were a brand new crew. Everybody was assigned on the same day to that ship. So they had to learn how to work together as a crew. Okay, in November 44, they transited the Panama Canal with the USS Missouri, which there's Missouri going through the canal, not a lot of room there going through. And they were also with the Texas and the Arkansas. And what struck me is the Missouri was probably the most modern battleship in the U.S. inventory. The Texas was built back before the First World War, when we didn't have the technology to build turbines, and it had the reciprocating piston engines, steam engines in the Texas. You can still see those two ships, the Missouri and the Texas, were both still preserved.
So that was the Iowa class battleships, I think, were the last battleships.
That's
ever
Iowa
built.
class, I think it
Yeah.
was Iowa was the last one, Wisconsin, Iowa.
Yeah,
And
Wisconsin.
the one that didn't make it to Kentucky.
Yeah,
Kentucky
right.
never got finished, and the bow for the Kentucky ended up on the front end of Wisconsin. But he sent this Christmas greetings from the, and you know, also by this time, he was a torpedoman first class. That means he was a non-commissioned officer by this time. This is V-mail. V-mail was a system where it worked both ways. Like a gal could write her hubby a letter, and it would be microfilmed. Of course, the censor went through it, and then they microfilmed it, and then they would send it to wherever it had to be, and then it was reconverted, printed to paper, and then given to the sailor, soldier, whatever it be. And I was reading this thing on that. They said the biggest problem they had with the V-mail from the wives' side was some of them would want to put a big smooch on it, and the lipstick would screw up the machines. But basically, he sent that home to show it. Okay, this is what we're doing. And a few days later, or at least with a postmark, on Christmas Day, 1944, the Weeks arrived at Eniwetok, which was a naval base at Eniwetok in the Marshall Islands. If you went there today, it's slightly radioactive because it was used for atomic bomb testing after the Second World War. You can dive there on some of the stuff, but I think you're limited on how long you can do it on the sun. From there, they went to Ulithi, and that's the base that they pretty well operated out of most of the time. And if you remember, I didn't really go into it. After the Battle of Santa Cruz, we only had one aircraft carrier in the Pacific, and it was damaged. And that was it. Well, that's all we had was one aircraft carrier operating in the South Pacific, and then they had elevators to take the airplanes up. And only one of the elevators worked. The other one, they had to fix it in place because they couldn't repair it. So we had one aircraft carrier. Okay, here's a view of Ulithi anchorage, and I look at this, and this is just a small part of the anchorage. If you look at that, it looks like there's two cruisers there. Off in the distance, way off in the distance, 1, 2, 3, 4 fleet carriers, Essex class carriers probably. And the USS Enterprise lurking over here to the side. And this was just a small number of the aircraft carriers we had in 1944. Each one of them had 60 to 70 airplanes or more on them. So what happened after the Battle of Santa Cruz was the Japanese won the battle and had to leave. They ran out of airplanes. They had no system for really training pilots or anything else. They had to go all the way back to Japan and get more pilots. So they would always snatch defeat out of the jaws of victory. The Japanese were kind of good at that. So anyway, I always thought this is a neat picture. It's not the Weeks there, but anyway, it's a similar destroyer. Okay, this was kind of what was going on. He was with Task Force 58. Some of the places that they attacked, now when they attacked, that means the airplanes from the Enterprise. They were screening the Enterprise, that was the centerpiece of Task Force 58, and they were attacking Formosa, which is today Taiwan, which was Japanese. They had attacked Hong Kong, Hainan Island, Cam Bay in what's now Vietnam. And in the other battles, he missed them, like the Second Battle of the Philippine Sea and all that. Typhoon Cobra, December 18, 1944, he missed that also. His ship was present for the invasions of both Okinawa and Iwo Jima. Okay, they want picket duty off Iwo Jima. Now what does picket duty mean? That means you are the first line to get hit. You are trying to protect all the other ships in the landing zone and everything from kamikazes. So there's people coming in. If they don't think they're going to make it all the way in, they'll try to get the first person they can find. That'll usually be the picket ship. Well, this is a Japanese Betty, Mitsubishi Betty, bomber. Now this picture shows it launching a torpedo. The Betty that attacked them didn't have a torpedo. And when I first read it, I thought, man, that's an awful big airplane to use for a kamikaze. But that's what they did. At least, I think it finally decided that it better crash into them. I think that was what it decided. Okay, a little bit about, this is from a little bit about a Weeks destroyer and where Joe was. This is a Sumner class destroyer, which is what the Weeks was. This is the forward torpedo station, right here in front of the stack. And in the back, you'll see the aft torpedo station. He was at the aft torpedo station, is where he was. This is a close-up of what the aft torpedo was like. That blast shield, I can imagine being in that. It was supposed to protect you from the 5-inch gun that was on the other side, away from it. And I'll put it this way, I've been on a tank range in a Jeep CJ5 with a metal covering on it. And when the main gun tank went off, I thought I was in a garbage can. So it was beating on the side, whang, you know. And that was 105 millimeters. So I just imagine what it was like. This kind of shows you what the firing mechanisms were. These were launched by black powder, is what they were done. Okay, so anyway, where was he? There's the torpedo tube. You see the little structure there, the structure with the door open. That was pretty much his station. I believe he was probably in charge, or the NCO in charge of that torpedo tube, the crew on those torpedo tubes. The story I heard was that he was inside something and the bullets were flying all around him. This Betty, when it came in, it was strafing. You know, it was firing at the ship as it came in. I'm thinking he was in there. And I took cover in there. Probably wasn't in there until he had to take cover. They probably took cover in there. And he was also partially shielded by a 5-inch gun that was behind him. The Japanese liked to attack from the rear if they could because they knew that there was less defenses to the rear than there was to the bow. So that's another reason why the Betty came in. And what it did was, it missed. It clipped the torpedo tubes. I'm not sure exactly how it did all that, but I asked him, I said, I had this little thing, he said, well, I see here on the internet that you were attacked by a bomber. And he was sitting in his chair in the kitchen, he was on oxygen, a little oxygen tank, and all of a sudden he goes, the SOB was right over there. And he pointed across the kitchen. I mean, that was ingrained, burned into his mind exactly what was going on. And so anyway, he said they had to send guys out to crawl out on the torpedo tubes to straighten them out so that they could jettison the torpedo. This is a torpedo being fired, but to jettison the torpedoes. After that, he saw more action. He was there when the USS Franklin was hit. The United States, after the loss of the Hornet, never lost, no, the Wasp, I think was next, never lost another fleet carrier after that. This ship, believe it or not, made it all the way back to Brooklyn, New York, from the Pacific. It never sailed again, but it made it all the way back. and it was considered repaired. This is a picture of the weeks at sea, transferring stores, probably a mail sack. Again, destroyers weren't very big. Whether with the ship taking the picture, I don't know. But they also refueled under these conditions. So, and then they set course for Okinawa. One of the things that happened in Okinawa was the largest Japanese battleship, the Yamato, was sent on a one-way kamikaze mission to Okinawa. The Japanese Navy, a lot of them were livid over that. The Yamato was a sacred name to Japan to start with, and to have this battleship being sent on a one-way kamikaze mission. But orders are orders, you know? And the idea was it was going to make it to Okinawa, drive itself up on the beach, and then use its guns to fight on Okinawa. That was the plan. They were told to order for some ready torpedoes. Now, I read a thing on the USS Dale, which was a lot smaller ship. When they were given an order in the Aleutians to ready torpedoes, they figured it was a suicide mission. Because you got to get up fairly close to launch torpedoes, at least within a mile or so. And they're shooting at you, you know?
So
it's big stuff.
So Bob, I built that model as a kid, as a teenager,
Yeah.
and it was a huge model. And if I remember correctly, you know, our battleships had 16-inch guns, and I think they had 18-inch
They
guns.
had 18-inch guns. It was the largest. In fact, there's a large-scale model of the ship in the Yamato Museum in Japan. I've seen a picture of it. So anyway, they rescinded those orders and said, "Are you out of your mind?" more or less. And so they didn't want. At first, they didn't want to spare the airplanes. They said, "We need the airplanes over here." I said, "No, you need the airplanes over here." So they ended up sinking the Yamato. The next thing was the USS Hancock. It was hit by a kamikaze, and with the weeks there, the only picture I can find of a whaleboat. They launched a whaleboat to pick up survivors of the Hancock, and I presume they transferred the survivors, and then the Weeks was ordered back to the task force, leaving them there. They were at sea, and it wasn't him. He was back on the ship with members of the crew. They had to wait until they got picked up the next day when it came back. I would like to ask you about this. They were hit by friendly fire with two 5-inch 38 shells, and one crewman was killed and 11 wounded. A lot of stuff goes on in a battle, and I said, with all those destroyers all firing at kamikazes, who knows where the shell came from. He went back, he was gone. By 28 September, he was gone. He complained to me, he said, didn't get to go to Tokyo Bay. He was not there when all this went on, the surrender at Tokyo Bay. And he was mustered out of all places, Minneapolis, Minnesota. So, and after serving 7 years and 1 day. And he told me, like every veteran I've ever heard say, I should have stayed in. He wouldn't have liked it at all. It would have been a wholly different Navy. Plus, imagine he was 18 years old when he went in. All that time, except for one leave to come home, and a Liberty in Hawaii where they got to go to a luau. You did mention that. They loaded all the trucks and took them to a luau. I mean, he spent all his time in combat or at sea and all that time. So he came back. He had a lot of living to do, and he tried. He tried, you know. And first thing he did was he bought a car. He couldn't drive. He had to learn how to drive. And I remember it was a 41 Chevy. And he bought a car. He went to school on the GI Bill. I don't know whether he ever finished it or not. It was a trade school. But he ended up just as well as a welder. And he ended up working in a conveyor company, making conveyors. So that's what he ended up doing. He didn't get married right away. A few years later, he went ahead and got married to Joan Catherine Stillings. And I said he kind of settled down, but he was a guy who could do anything. He built a room on their house. He did all of it. if you could make it with your hands, he could do it. He was nothing that ever stopped. A camper for the, he did all kinds of stuff. He had two boys, Patrick in the center there, and then Joseph. And as far, I know Joseph's retired. I'm not sure about Patrick. I haven't caught up with him lately on what he's doing. But anyway, and he led a really quiet life after that. And they passed away on May 1st, 2004, and John in 2018. So, I mean, he had a good life. He went through a lot of stuff during the war. He managed to survive it okay. So anyway, that's his story. Any questions?
Very good, Bob. So he was born 3 months before my dad.
Oh, really?
Yeah, 21. Yeah.
Yeah, it was hard to imagine to me that he would be over 100 years old now.
The one picture, my dad also went to Great Lakes, and that one picture you showed him in his uniform was one of my dad.
I think everybody had a picture taken there.
In a similar, in a similar
that was
uniform.
the place.
When he had hair, you know, he was only 20 something.
I had hair.
Yeah. So,
Okay, well, thank you very much.
yeah. Thank you. Great.
Thank you.